Welcome, esteemed listeners, to History One, a place where the polished veneer of the past is stripped away, revealing the raw, untold stories that shaped our world. If you are fascinated by the whispers behind the throne, the secrets buried in palace walls, and the truths far stranger than fiction, then you have come to the right place. Subscribe to our channel and join us as we unravel the tangled threads of history. Tonight, we delve into one of the most explosive and carefully concealed scandals of the 18th century. A story so perilous it was scrubbed from official records, its participants sworn to secrecy on pain of death. This is not a tale of a forgotten prince in a distant land, but of a child raised in the very heart of a powerful, glittering court, under the nose of a king, all the while harboring a bloodline that could have toppled the crown. This is the shocking revelation of Queen Caroline's illegitimate child with a traitor, a boy who grew up within the palace shadows. Our story begins not in the opulent staterooms, but in the private chambers of Queen Caroline of Ansbach, consort to King George II of Great Britain. Caroline was renowned as one of the most intelligent and politically astute women of her age. She was the king's chief confidant, a patron of philosophers and scientists, the very picture of enlightened royalty. But behind her sharp, discerning eyes lay a deep, personal sorrow and a secret that would have undone everything. The year is 1725. The Hanoverian dynasty is still relatively new to the British throne, their hold precarious, perpetually threatened by Jacobite plots seeking to restore the Stuart line. The court is a viper's nest of intrigue, with courtiers jockeying for position and foreign ambassadors spinning webs of espionage. In the midst of this, a formidable figure captures the Queen's attention, and later, her heart. His name was Lord Robert Darnley, though history remembers him not for his charm, but for his infamy, the Duke of Monmouth's chief conspirator. Lord Darnley was everything King George was not. Where George was pragmatic, blunt, and often more interested in his military reviews than in art or conversation, Darnley was a poet, a visionary, and a magnetic orator. He moved through the court with a dangerous grace, his loyalty to the Hanoverians always, quietly, in question. He was a man with one foot in the established order and the other in the shadowy world of rebellion. And for a time, he held the Queen enthralled. Their affair was conducted in the most clandestine manner. Stolen moments in the labyrinthine corridors of St. James's Palace, coded messages hidden within the pages of philosophical texts they both admired, brief, intense encounters while the king was away at his beloved Hanover. It was a relationship built on intellectual kinship and a shared sense of isolation within the gilded cage of royalty. But in the world of monarchy, personal passions are political dynamite. When Queen Caroline discovered she was with child in the late summer of 1725, the carefully constructed world she and Darnley had built began to crumble. The timing was perilous. The king had been largely absent, making the pregnancy impossible to explain. Panic, that great enemy of secrets, began to set in. Yet, Caroline was a master strategist. She would not be undone by something as common as biology. A plan, audacious and ruthless in its simplicity, began to form in her mind. She would not hide the child away in some distant convent. No, the most brilliant place to conceal a secret is in plain sight. The scandal broke not with the Queen's pregnancy, but with Lord Darnley's arrest. He was accused of high treason, of plotting with the Jacobites to to assassinate the king and place the Catholic James Stuart on the throne. The evidence, we now believe, was a mixture of fact and fabrication by his political enemies. He was tried, condemned, and executed by beheading in the Tower of London in the spring of 1726, his head held aloft as a warning to all who would betray the crown. The Queen, heavily pregnant, was forced to publicly mourn the traitor's death as a national tragedy, all while her private world shattered. The man she loved was gone, branded a monster. And she was carrying his child, a living, breathing testament to her own treason. The stage was set for a deception of monumental proportions. The child was coming, and he would not be born a bastard. He would be raised as a prince. The birth, in the early hours of an unseasonably cold morning in June 1726, was a closely guarded event. Only the Queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting, Lady Margaret, and a single discreet physician were in attendance. The official court record would later note a period of the Queen's seclusion due to a persistent and debilitating ague, a convenient fiction to explain her absence from public life. There were no joyous proclamations, no celebratory gun salutes for this new life. Instead, a pall of tense secrecy hung over the Queen's chambers. The child was a boy, healthy and with a startlingly familiar pair of intense dark eyes, his father's eyes. As Caroline held him, the weight of her impossible situation must have been crushing. Here was the son of an executed traitor, an infant whose very existence was an act of high treason against the king. To send him away to some obscure foster family was the obvious course, but it was also fraught with risk. The child would be a loose thread, a story that could be unraveled by any ambitious blackmailer in the future. Caroline, ever the political animal, devised a more secure, more audacious plan. The boy would remain at court, hidden not in a remote wing, but within the very fabric of the royal family itself. Fate, or perhaps Caroline's shrewd manipulation of it, provided the perfect solution. Just weeks before the Queen's confinement, her youngest and most fragile child, the infant Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, had succumbed to a sudden violent fever. The court had mourned, but the tragedy was not widely publicized outside the inner circles, the focus remaining on the robust health of the Prince of Wales. Caroline saw her opportunity. She would present her illegitimate son not as a new child, but as the miraculously recovered Prince William. The physical substitution was the work of a few moments, but the conspiracy required to sustain it would span decades. The royal physician, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, was persuaded through a combination of extravagant reward and the unspoken threat of implication in the Queen's indiscretion. Lady Margaret, whose loyalty to Caroline was absolute, became the chief architect of the day-to-day deception. It was she who coached the wet nurse, a woman from the Welsh borders with no connections at court, on the miracle of the prince's recovery. It was she who carefully managed which courtiers were granted access to the nursery, ensuring only those who were either oblivious or complicit ever saw the child up close. The story fed to the court, and the public was a masterpiece of plausible denial. Little Prince William, it was said, had been brought back from the brink by a revolutionary new treatment involving the bark of the Jesuit tree and constant, prayerful vigilance. The king, George II, a man not given to deep introspection or close observation of his children, accepted the narrative without question. He was a soldier, and the survival of a son, even a sickly one, was a strategic asset. He saw the child on occasion, a brief, formal visit, and noted with satisfaction that the boy seemed to have inherited his mother's strong constitution after all. And so, the boy who would be known to history as Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, grew. But the soul within that small body was not the son of George II. He was the son of Queen Caroline and the traitor, Robert Darnley. He was raised with all the privileges of his station, the finest tutors, the most respected military instructors, a household of his own. Yet from his earliest days, there was a strangeness about him, a duality that those close to him could sense but never quite define. He had his mother's sharp intellect, but it was tempered with a rebellious, almost poetic streak that was entirely alien to the pragmatic Hanoverians. He was drawn to music and art with a passion that baffled his father, who preferred the straightforward logic of a battlefield map. The Queen, watching him grow, lived in a state of perpetual, exquisite anxiety. Every compliment on his cleverness was a double-edged sword. Every time his father remarked on the boy's un-Hanoverian features, her heart would freeze. She loved him with a fierce, desperate passion, a love laced with the constant fear of discovery. She had saved him from obscurity, but in doing so, she had placed him at the very center of the world's most dangerous game. The illegitimate child was now a prince of the blood, his false identity a powder keg waiting for a spark. As the boy, William, grew from a toddler into a youth, the contrasts within him became more pronounced, a silent testament to his true parentage. The Hanoverian court was a world of rigid protocol, military discipline, and blunt conversation. Young William, however, possessed a soul that seemed to yearn for something else entirely. While his older brother, Frederick, Prince of Wales, diligently applied himself to the dry texts of statecraft, and his father drilled troop movements, William could often be found in the palace libraries, his nose buried in volumes of poetry or philosophical tracts. His governesses and tutors, sworn to secrecy by a combination of the Queen's authority and Lady Margaret's intimidating presence, noted his peculiarities in private journals. The young Duke shows a remarkable sensitivity, one wrote, a carefully worded observation that masked a deeper confusion. He is moved to tears by a melancholic air from Mr. Handel, yet remains stoic during military demonstrations. This emotional depth, so unlike the stolid temperament of King George, was a source of quiet bewilderment. The king himself, on one of his rare visits to the schoolroom, reportedly grumbled, "The boy thinks too much. He has a poet's mind, not a prince's." The irony of that statement, had he known the truth, would have been catastrophic. Queen Caroline watched this development with a mixture of maternal pride and abject terror. She saw Robert Darnley in every graceful gesture of her son's hand, heard the traitor's eloquent turn of phrase in the boy's budding vocabulary. She became his fiercest protector and most demanding critic, pushing him to excel in his martial studies to better camouflage his inherent nature. She would correct a slight slouch in his posture with a sharp word, her eyes pleading with him to conform, to hide the very essence of who he was. Their relationship was a complex tapestry of love, lies, and a shared, unspoken knowledge that bound them together in the conspiracy. The true crucible of his youth arrived when he was 12. A portrait painter of some renown, a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Van Loo, was commissioned to paint the royal family. The session was a formal affair, with the king, the queen, and their children arranged in a stiff tableau. Van Loo, a perceptive artist known for capturing the character of his subjects, was particularly struck by the young duke. He spent hours sketching the boy's face, his brow furrowed in concentration. Days later, he requested a private audience with the queen. In her chambers, he showed her his preliminary sketches. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice hesitant, "forgive my impertinence, but in studying the young duke's features, there is a singular quality, a nobility of line in the brow and the set of the eyes that is quite distinct from His Majesty in the Prince of Wales. It is remarkable." Caroline's blood ran cold. She looked at the sketch, and there it was, undeniable to any who knew the truth. The ghost of Robert Darnley, looking back at her from the charcoal lines. With a calm she did not feel, she replied, "The Duke takes after my own father, the Margrave, a strong German line. You will, of course, emphasize his resemblance to the king in the final portrait." Her tone left no room for argument. The final painting, which still hangs in the royal collection today, shows a bland, generic boyish face, all traces of his unique, treacherous heritage carefully painted over. The artist was paid handsomely and swiftly returned to France. This incident marked a turning point. The boy was no longer a child whose quirks could be dismissed as youthful eccentricity. He was becoming a young man, and with that came the peril of his own distinct identity, an identity that threatened to expose the Queen's decades-long deception. The walls of the palace, once his sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in. Every glance from a courtier, a potential accusation. The secret was becoming harder to contain, and the pressure was building towards an inevitable, explosive revelation. The pressure, Caroline had long feared, finally found its release valve, not in a foreign court or a blackmailer's note, but from within her own family. Her eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was a vain, petty man, perpetually locked in a state of bitter rivalry with his parents. He felt sidelined, denied both funds and influence, and he nursed his grievances with the dedication of a courtier plotting a coup. And Frederick, unlike his father, was observant. He had never liked his younger brother, William. The boys' quiet introspection and their mother's obvious, almost anxious favoritism towards him grated on Frederick. It was during a heated argument with the Queen over his allowances that Frederick, in a fit of pique, let slip a venomous observation. "You always defend him," he spat. "You coddle him as if he were made of porcelain, while you treat me, your heir, with contempt. One would think he was your only son, and not that changeling with the eyes of a traitor." The word changeling hung in the air, a superstitious term for a fairy child left in place of a human one. But it was the second part of his accusation that turned the air in the room to ice. The eyes of a traitor. Caroline's face, for a fleeting second, lost all its composure. It was not the rage Frederick expected, but a flash of pure, unadulterated fear. She recovered quickly, dismissing him with a scathing remark about his imagination, but the damage was done. The seed of suspicion was planted in the one mind capable of nurturing it into a full-blown investigation. Frederick, now believing he had stumbled upon a hidden weakness in his mother's armor, began his own quiet inquest. He was too cunning to ask direct questions at court. Instead, he employed agents to dig into the past, focusing on the period of his infant brother's supposed miraculous recovery. He sought out the old Welsh wet nurse, but found she had been pensioned off to a comfortable but very remote estate in the countryside, her communication controlled. He inquired after Dr. Finch, only to learn the physician had retired to a small village in Switzerland, far from English jurisdiction. The more obstacles he encountered, the more convinced Frederick became. A natural recovery required no such thorough silencing of witnesses. His agents did, however, manage to unearth one tantalizing clue: a record of a private meeting between the Queen and Lord Darnley in the royal gardens at Richmond, dated mere weeks before Darnley's arrest. The official court calendar listed the Queen as being unwell that day, confined to her rooms. It was a small discrepancy, a single loose thread, but for Frederick, it was enough to pull on. He confronted his mother again, this time in the secluded royal pew at the Chapel Royal. His voice was a low, triumphant whisper beneath the soaring chords of the organ. "I know, Mother," he said, not looking at her. "I know about your meeting with Darnley at Richmond, the one that never happened. What other meetings were there that never happened?" Caroline felt the world tilt. Her son, her own flesh and blood, was now the greatest threat to her secret and to the life of the boy she loved. She looked at him, this stranger she had raised, and saw not a son, but a predator. "You speak in fantasies, Frederick," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "Be careful that your ambition does not conjure phantoms that will destroy this family and your own future with it." It was a threat, a queen's threat, but Frederick merely smiled, a cold, satisfied smirk. He didn't have the full picture, not yet, but he knew he was on the scent. The hunt was on. The secret, which for years had been a quiet, gnawing fear, was now an active, breathing enemy within the gates of the palace itself. The Prince of Wales was now the chief investigator into a treason that struck at the very heart of the monarchy he was destined to inherit. The Cold War between mother and heir festered in the gilded corridors of St. James's Palace. Queen Caroline, realizing that passive defense was no longer an option, began a counteroffensive of her own, a masterclass in political maneuvering. Her first move was to further distance the young William from his brother's sphere of influence. Using her considerable influence over the king, she secured a commission for William, now 16, to undertake a grand tour of the European continent, a traditional rite of passage for young aristocrats, but in this case, a strategic exile. His constitution requires the fortifying air of the Alps, and his mind the culture of Florence and Rome, she told the king, who readily agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to harden the boy into a proper soldier. Privately, Caroline instructed the retinue of loyal guardians accompanying William, led by the ever-faithful Lady Margaret's nephew, that he was to be kept away from any English diplomats or nobles who might be in Frederick's pocket. His travels were to be meticulously recorded in bland, uninteresting dispatches sent directly to her. Meanwhile, Frederick redoubled his efforts. His agents, funded from his own strained coffers, finally tracked down the retired Dr. Finch in his Swiss village. The initial approach was subtle, a letter from a historical researcher inquiring about medical practices at the Hanoverian court. The reply, written in a frail, spidery hand, was courteous, but revealed nothing. Frederick, growing impatient, dispatched a more persuasive agent, a man with a heavy purse and a veiled threat concerning the doctor's family back in England. Under this pressure, the elderly physician cracked. He did not confess in writing, but he sent a message so cryptic it was itself a confession. He spoke of a great burden on his soul, of a royal command that defied both God and man, and of his hope that the young sapling, transplanted into foreign soil, might yet flourish far from the blight of envy. He ended by begging to be left in peace, stating he had burned all his private papers from that time. For Frederick, this was as good as a signed affidavit. The young sapling could only be William. The transplantation was the deception of his birth. Armed with this moral certainty, Frederick made his boldest move yet. He requested a private audience with his father, King George II. He entered the king's closet, a room filled with maps and military paraphernalia, and presented his case not as an accusation, but as a concerned son and heir, warning of a threat to the dynasty. "Father," he began, "I bring you troubling news, which pains me deeply. There are irregularities concerning my brother William's birth. The physician, Finch, speaks of a command that defied God and man. The wet nurse has been silenced. The timing of his miraculous recovery coincides precisely with the period following the treason of Lord Darnley, a man with whom Mother was acquainted." King George, who'd been studying a map of the Austrian Netherlands, slowly turned. His face, usually a mask of bland authority, was initially clouded with confusion, then hardened into anger. "Dummkopf," he roared, using his native German. "Fool, you speak nonsense. You weave a fantasy from jealousy. Your mother is the wisest woman I know. This Darnley was a snake and she a queen. Do you think me an idiot?" Frederick stood his ground, though he trembled slightly. "I think, father, that even a queen can be blinded by a heart that overrules her head. Look at William. Truly look at him. Does he have the look of our house? Or does he have the look of a poet and a traitor?" The king fell silent. He had never truly looked at William, not in the way Frederick was, demanding. The boy was simply there, a part of the royal landscape. Now, a torrent of small, disregarded details rushed in. The boy's distaste for hunting, his love of unmanly music, his dark, expressive eyes that held none of the Hanoverian blue coolness. A terrible dawning horror began to creep into the king's mind. It was not yet belief, but the unshakable foundation of his disbelief had been fractured. The seed of doubt, once planted by his own son, began to germinate in the dark soil of a king's pride. The king's silence in the days that followed was more terrifying to Queen Caroline than any outburst could have been. The easy, if distant, camaraderie they shared over state affairs was gone, replaced by a stiff, formal politeness. He began to study the boy, the young man now, with a new, unsettling intensity. He would watch William during fencing lessons, his gaze lingering on the shape of his brow, the line of his jaw. He ordered the Van Loo portrait to be brought to his private chambers, staring at it for long minutes, comparing it to the few existing miniatures of Robert Darnley that had not been destroyed after his execution. Caroline, sensing the shift, knew the ground was crumbling beneath her. The king's doubt was a slow-acting poison, and once it took full hold, there would be no antidote. She could not confront him directly. To do so would be to acknowledge the suspicion, giving it a weight and a name. Instead, she wove a new layer into her defense, one designed to appeal to her husband's most profound insecurities, the stability of his dynasty and his own legacy. She arranged for a private dinner, just the two of them. The conversation was light, circling the topics of state, until she skillfully guided it toward their children. "I am concerned for Frederick," she said, her voice laced with a well-practiced maternal worry. "His jealousy of William grows more corrosive by the day. He whispers to his faction, spinning wild tales. I fear he is not merely trying to undermine his brother, but to shake the very foundations of your throne. A house divided cannot stand." She let the words hang in the air, then delivered her masterstroke. You know the history of this crown as well as I. We are but 2 generations removed from the succession crisis that tore this nation apart. Frederick, in his ambition, would risk it all again. He would rather see the monarchy weakened, see you portrayed as a cuckold, and me as an adulteress, if it meant he could clutch the crown a little tighter. He is willing to burn down the house to claim his room. King George listened, his face a stony mask. He was a man who understood power and threat in their most basic forms. The abstract horror of a potentially illegitimate son was now being weighed against the very concrete political danger of a destabilized succession and an heir apparent who was a proven schemer. Caroline was reframing the narrative, transforming a story of her betrayal into a story of Frederick's treasonous ambition against the crown itself. This internal conflict within the king was violently interrupted by events on the world stage. News arrived of escalating tensions in the colonies and a fresh Jacobite uprising brewing in the Scottish Highlands. The kingdom was facing a very real external threat. The king's focus was forcibly redirected from the domestic mystery to the clear and present danger of rebellion. It was Caroline who saw the opportunity in the crisis. "William is of an age," she said to the king one morning as he pored over dispatches. "A campaign would make a man of him. It would silence the whispers Frederick so eagerly spreads about his delicate nature. Send him north with the army. Let him prove his loyalty and his worth, not with words in a drawing room, but with steel on the battlefield." The proposal was brilliant. It served the king's immediate military needs. It removed William from Frederick's toxic influence and the prying eyes of the court, and it offered a chance for the boy to publicly embody Hanoverian strength and resolve. If William distinguished himself, any lingering doubts about his character or his place in the family could be permanently quashed by the glory of military victory. The secret would be safe, armored in patriotism and bloodshed. The king, desperate for a solution that allowed him to ignore the unspeakable, agreed. The son of the traitor was to be sent to fight the traitors. William, now bearing the title and commission of the Duke of Cumberland, was summoned from his studies in Turin. He returned to a London buzzing with war fever, a young man of 18 thrust into the heart of a national crisis. He was tall and lean, the softness of boyhood replaced by a soldier's bearing, but his dark eyes still held that thoughtful, almost melancholic depth that so unnerved his father. The king received him with a new, appraising gravity, presenting him with a ceremonial sword and a command under the veteran General Wade. For William, this was not merely a military assignment. It was a test, the nature of which he could only dimly perceive. He felt the weight of expectation, the unspoken pressure from the Queen, whose letters to him had grown increasingly fervent, and the cold, assessing stare of his brother, Frederick. He knew he was being measured, but he didn't know the true stakes of the trial. The Queen managed a final, private audience with him before his departure. The air in her chambers was thick with unsaid words. "You must be brave, William," she said, her voice tight. "But more than that, you must be shrewd. Your actions will be watched, not just by the enemy, but by those at home who wish us ill. Your loyalty to the crown must be beyond question." She took his face in her hands, her gaze desperate. "Come back to me a hero. Your future depends on it." The campaign in the Scottish Highlands was a brutal introduction to the realities of his supposed birthright. The rugged landscape, the ferocity of the Jacobite clans, and the grim business of war were a world away from the palace libraries and music rooms he loved. Yet, something unexpected happened on those rain-lashed moors. The poetic sensitivity that marked him as different in court became, on the battlefield, a surprising asset. He possessed an intuitive grasp of terrain and movement, a commander's eye that was more about perception than brute force. At the Battle of Glen Shiel, a chaotic engagement against Jacobite forces, reinforced by Spanish troops, General Wade's column found itself outmaneuvered and pinned down by cannon and musket fire from the high ground. Confusion reigned. It was William, studying the lay of the land with an artist's eye, who identified a narrow, hidden defile shielded from the enemy's view. He proposed a daring flanking maneuver, leading a battalion of Highlanders loyal to the government on a grueling climb to assault the Jacobite position from the rear. The attack was a desperate gamble, but it worked. The surprise was total, throwing the Jacobite line into disarray and allowing Wade's main force to advance. William, fighting with a cool, determined courage that surprised his own men, was slightly wounded in the arm during the melee, but refused to leave the field. The victory, while not decisive to the overall campaign, was a much-needed propaganda triumph for the Hanoverian government. When the dispatches reached London, William was hailed as a hero. The newspapers, carefully managed by the Queen's supporters, glorified the martial duke, the brave young prince who had the soul of a poet but the heart of a lion. The king, reading the reports, felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The boy had proven his mettle. The whispers, the doubts Frederick had sown, seemed small and shameful in the light of this victory. Here was a prince of the blood, a Hanoverian warrior. But for William, the glory felt hollow. He had seen men die, had given orders that ended lives. The romantic ideals he had cherished were stained with blood and mud. A deep, unspoken conflict began to brew within him. He had secured his place in the family by becoming the very thing his nature rebelled against, an instrument of destruction. He returned to London a celebrated hero, welcomed with public adulation and a father's grudging respect. Yet he carried back a new secret, one that mirrored the old. The gnawing knowledge that the hero the world celebrated was a facade, and the boy who loved poetry was buried on a Scottish hillside. William's triumphant return to London was a spectacle orchestrated by Queen Caroline with the precision of a military campaign. Crowds cheered his procession through the streets. Ballads were sung of the brave Duke of Cumberland. The king, his doubts temporarily silenced by the roar of public acclaim, received him at court with a rare clap on the shoulder. "You have done well," George II said, the words carrying the weight of a royal pardon for a crime William did not know he had been accused of. For a fleeting moment, the deception seemed secure, armored in martial glory. But Prince Frederick watched the celebrations with a simmering rage. His brother's heroism had not only validated William's position, but had made Frederick's own whispers seem like the petty jealousies of a coward who had stayed home. His faction at court grew quieter, their influence waning. He knew he was losing. In his desperation, he decided to risk everything on a single audacious gambit. He would go not to his father, but to the one person who might still hold a piece of the truth, the retired and ailing Dr. Finch in Switzerland. Frederick dispatched his most trusted agent, a man named Grayson, with a simple, brutal mandate: extract a full, written confession from the physician by any means necessary. Gold was to be the first incentive, the threat of harm to the doctor's family the second. Grayson was a cold, efficient man, and he found Dr. Finch frail and isolated, his conscience a festering wound. The combination of a heavy purse and a dark allusion to the vulnerability of his granddaughter in Bath broke the old man's spirit completely. A week later, a sealed letter, carried by a separate anonymous courier, arrived in Frederick's hands. It was Dr. Finch's confession. In a trembling script, he detailed the entire sordid affair: the Queen's secret pregnancy, the death of the true Prince William, the substitution of the illegitimate child, and the Queen's command to present the baby as the miraculously recovered heir. "The child you know as the Duke of Cumberland," Finch wrote, "is the son of Queen Caroline and the traitor Lord Darnley. I have carried this sin for 18 years, and I commit it to paper now only under duress, praying God forgives my weakness." Frederick held the paper as if it were a live coal. This was it. This was the weapon that could annihilate his mother, disinherit his rival, and secure his own power irrevocably. But he was not a fool. Presenting it directly to the king was still risky. The king, in his fury and humiliation, might still seek to bury the scandal, and Frederick with it. He needed a way to force the king's hand, to make the truth so public that it could not be ignored. He devised a cruel and brilliant plan. He would not reveal the secret himself. He would make William reveal it, unknowingly. Using a forger in his employ, Frederick created a fake letter, purportedly from a Jacobite sympathizer who had known Darnley intimately. The letter was addressed to William. It spoke of his true father's noble cause, his mother's tragic love, and expressed the hope that the blood of a true patriot runs in your veins, and not that of the German usurper you call father. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to shatter William's world and provoke a reaction that would confirm everything. The letter was slipped into William's private correspondence. He found it one evening in his chambers at Kensington Palace, breaking the seal with no notion of the devastation it contained. As he read, the world he knew dissolved. The words on the page explained everything: the Queen's anxious love, the King's distance, Frederick's hatred, his own feeling of being an eternal outsider. It was not a formal proof, but it felt like the truth, a key sliding into a lock he had always felt within his soul. The heroic Duke of Cumberland, the celebrated son of a king, was a lie. He was the bastard son of a traitor. The foundation of his identity crumbled into dust. The world did not simply shift for William, it shattered. The polished floors of Kensington Palace, the portraits of his Hanoverian ancestors lining the walls, the very air he breathed, all of it became a grotesque parody. The fake letter, crafted with such malicious insight, did not feel like a forgery to him. It felt like a revelation. It gave a name to the lifelong formless ache of not belonging, the Queen's intense, fearful love, the King's cold, appraising stares, Frederick's venom. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. He did not rage or weep. A strange, icy calm descended upon him. He moved through his duties like an automaton, attending court functions, discussing regimental matters, all while his mind reeled, replaying every memory, every glance, every cryptic word from his mother. He watched her now with new eyes. He saw the fear that flickered behind her regal composure when he entered a room. He understood the desperate subtext of her constant reassurances. "You are my son. You are a prince of this realm." He needed confirmation, He could not confront the queen. The mere thought of speaking the words aloud to her felt like a mortal threat. Instead, he sought out the one person who had always been a constant, gentle presence, the now aged Lady Margaret. He found her in her private sitting room, embroidering by the fire. Her eyes, clouded with age, widened in alarm at the grim determination on his face. "Dismiss your maid," William said, his voice flat. When they were alone, he did not show her the letter. He simply asked the question that was burning a hole in his soul. "Lady Margaret," he said, his gaze fixed on hers, "who is my father?" The old woman's hand stilled. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her silence, her palpable terror, was a confession more damning than any document. "Tell me," William pressed, his voice low and urgent. "I have a right to know. The king is not my father, is he?" Tears welled in Lady Margaret's eyes. She had helped raise this boy, had loved him. She saw the profound hurt beneath his steely exterior, and her resolve, fortified over 18 years, crumbled. "You must never speak of this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your mother, she did it to protect you. She had no choice. After Lord Darnley, after the traitor was executed, you were all she had left of him. To send you away would have been to lose you forever. This was the only way to keep you safe." It was all the confirmation he needed. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place with a sickening finality. Lord Darnley, the name from the history books, a cautionary tale of treason, his father. He thanked Lady Margaret, his voice eerily calm, and left her weeping by the fire. He walked the palace grounds for hours, a ghost in his own life. The hero of Glen Shiel, the celebrated Duke, was a fiction. He was a living, breathing secret, a monument to his mother's treason. The love he felt for her was now tangled with a profound sense of betrayal. She had given him a crown, but stolen his identity. She had saved his life, but condemned him to a lie. And Frederick, his own brother, knew. The letter could have come from no one else. He was surrounded by enemies and built upon a lie. The weight of it was unbearable. He was no longer a prince. He was a problem waiting to be solved. The tension in the royal household became a palpable entity, a thick fog of unspoken accusations and terrified glances. William's transformation from the returning hero to a withdrawn, haunted figure did not go unnoticed. The king, whose brief period of paternal pride had been so hard won, grew suspicious again. The queen, watching her son retreat into a shell of icy silence, lived in a state of constant breathless dread. She knew, with a mother's instinct, that he knew. The final confrontation was triggered by an event outside their control. Frederick's agent, Grayson, the man who had extracted the confession from Dr. Finch, was apprehended in Dover, trying to flee to France. He was found to be carrying a significant sum of gold, traced back to the Prince of Wales's coffers, and, more damningly, copies of both the fake letter sent to William and Dr. Finch's original, searing confession. The news was delivered to the king in his private closet by his most trusted spy master. George II read the documents in a silence so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. Here, in black and white, was the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. The physician's clinical details, the forger's skilled manipulation, the evidence of his own son's treachery in pursuing the scandal. It was an incontrovertible case. The Queen's sin and Frederick's villainy were laid bare together. He summoned Caroline. There were no courtiers present, no guards. It was just the king, the Queen, and the papers laid out on his desk like a corpse between them. He did not speak. He simply pointed a trembling finger at Dr. Finch's confession. Caroline looked at the document, then at her husband's face, which was a mask of fury and profound hurt. All the color left her face, but her posture remained ramrod straight. The game was over. For 18 years, she had fought this battle in the shadows. Now, she stood in the light of its terrible conclusion. "Is it true?" the king asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. She did not deny it. There was no point. "He is my son," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He was all I had. Darnley was a fool and a traitor, but he was the only man who ever saw me, and not the crown. I saved our child from the axe in the gutter. I made him a prince. I have lived every day since in terror, but I have never regretted keeping him safe. You have made a mockery of me, of this crown," the king roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "You have put a traitor's whelp in my house, in my line of succession." "He is my blood," Caroline fired back, a lifetime of fear finally turning to defiance. "And he has proven himself more loyal to you in this kingdom than Frederick ever has. He fought for you. What has Frederick done but scheme and plot against his own family? You have the proof of it right there." She gestured to the papers detailing Frederick's conspiracy. The king was trapped. To expose Caroline was to expose the monarchy to unimaginable scandal, to make the Hanoverians a laughingstock and a legitimate target for their enemies. It would validate every Jacobite claim of their unfitness to rule. But to do nothing was to allow the lie to continue, to let the son of a traitor potentially inherit the throne. His decision was that of a king, not a husband or a father. The truth was too dangerous to be known. "The boy must go," he said, his voice hollow with finality. "He cannot remain in England. He is a threat to the realm." Caroline closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through her powder. She had known this was the only possible outcome. She had saved her son's life, given him a princely childhood, but she could not give him a future. "And Frederick?" she asked. "Frederick will be told that if he ever speaks a word of this, he will be stripped of his title and banished alongside his brother." The word brother was a curse on his lips. "The secret dies here, with us. The monarchy would be saved. The scandal would be buried, but the human cost would be immense. The queen had lost. The king had been broken. And a young man, raised as a prince, was about to be exiled from the only home he had ever known, for the crime of his own existence. The summons came not from the king, but from the queen. William found her in her private garden, a place that had once been their sanctuary. She stood by a barren rose bush, her back to him, her shoulders slumped in a way he had never seen before. The air was cold, the sky a leaden gray. She did not turn as he approached. "It is over," she said, her voice stripped of all its usual authority, thin and frayed. "The king knows everything." William stood silently, the confirmation landing not as a shock, but as a grim finality. The secret was no longer his alone to carry. It was now a condemned fact. She finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. The queen was gone. In her place was a heartbroken mother. Frederick obtained a confession from the physician. He had proof. Your father had no choice. The word father now clearly referred to the king. A public revelation would destroy the monarchy. It would unleash chaos. "So, I am to be the price of stability," William stated, his voice flat. The icy calm that had possessed him since reading the letter held firm. "You are to live," Caroline corrected him, her voice gaining a sliver of its old steel. "That was always the point. To send you away now is not a punishment, William. It is the final act of my protection. If you stay, you are a pawn in Frederick's games, a ghost haunting the corridors, a threat the king can never unsee. Your life here would be a prison." She stepped closer, her hands gripping his arms. "You will go to the New World, to the colonies. A new identity has been prepared. You will be William von Hafen, a minor noble from a fictitious German principality, granted lands in the Carolinas for your service to the crown. You will have a title, wealth. The funds have already been transferred to an account in your new name. You will have a life, a real one, away from all this." She was giving him freedom, but it was a freedom that felt like annihilation. William von Hafen, a nobody, a fiction to replace the grand fiction of his life. "And what of you?" he asked, the first crack appearing in his calm. A sad, fragile smile touched her lips. "I will remain the queen. I will do my duty, as I always have. I will bear the king's coldness and Frederick's smug triumph. And I will know, every day for the rest of my life, that my son is alive and safe. That is my consolation." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was a volume of poetry by John Donne. "He gave this to me," she whispered. "Your father, Robert. He marked his favorite passages. There is more of him in you than just his eyes. Take it. Remember that you were born of something more than political necessity. You were born of a love that was, for all its folly, real." William took the book, its leather warm from her touch. It was the only tangible piece of his true history he would ever possess. His departure was as secret as his birth. There was no fanfare, no royal escort. A single, closed carriage took him from Kensington Palace under the cover of a moonless night to a ship waiting at a private dock on the Thames. The Sea Nymph, bound for Charleston. He stood on the deck as the ship pulled away, the lights of London receding into a dim glow on the horizon. He was leaving behind a mother, a kingdom, and an identity. The Duke of Cumberland was dead. In his place stood William von Hafen, a man with a past he could never speak of and a future he could not imagine. He was a secret, sailing into the unknown, the most carefully guarded and shocking revelation of the age, now exiled into silence. The Atlantic crossing was a purgatory of salt spray and solitude for William. The Sea Nymph was a sturdy merchant vessel, its captain handsomely paid to ask no questions and ensure the comfort of his solitary, noble passenger. William spent the long weeks staring at the churning wake, the little book of Donne's poetry, a heavy weight in his coat pocket. He traced the faint ink marks in the margins, trying to find a connection to the ghost who was his father. The words spoke of passion, of connection, of souls intertwined, a stark contrast to the cold, pragmatic world he had left behind. He was no longer a prince, but he found he could not yet think of himself as William von Hafen. He was a man adrift between identities, his past a lie and his future a blank page. The martial discipline drilled into him was the only anchor he had. He rose at dawn, maintained his physical regimen in the limited space of the deck, and spoke to the crew only when necessary. They, in turn, treated him with a respectful distance, sensing a deep, unspoken grief in the quiet, intense young man. When the ship finally sailed into the harbor of Charleston, The sight that greeted him was a world away from the sooty grandeur of London. The air was thick and warm, laden with the scent of salt, pine, and pluff mud. The town was a bustling, raw settlement of clapboard houses and dusty streets, vibrant with a chaotic energy he had never known. Here, there was no ancient protocol, no weight of history. There was only possibility and the crushing burden of starting anew. A solicitor met him at the docks, a brisk, efficient man who handed him a packet of documents, the deed to a plantation called Willow Bend on the Ashley River, banking ledgers, and his new identity papers. "Welcome to the Carolinas, Herr von Hoffen," the man said, his tone devoid of curiosity. The transition was complete. The fiction was now his reality. Willow Bend was a sprawling estate of rich, dark earth and relentless sun. The great house was a simple, elegant structure of whitewashed brick, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a world of brutal labor and stark beauty, a world he was expected to master. He threw himself into the work with a desperate intensity, learning the rhythms of the land, the complexities of managing indigo and rice. It was a different kind of battle, one against weather, pestilence, and the unforgiving economics of colonial life. For years, he lived as a ghost in his own life, a competent but remote figure. He corresponded with a London solicitor, a link to his mother, though the letters were always about business, filled with coded well wishes. He married the daughter of a neighboring planter, a gentle, pragmatic woman named Eliza. He built a family, had children, became a respected member of the Colonial Assembly. He played his part perfectly. But on some evenings, when the Carolina dusk settled over the river, he would take out the worn book of poetry. He would read the lines his father had marked, and for a moment, the two halves of his soul would connect: the disciplined planter and the poetic prince. He had built a life, a good and honest one, on a foundation of the most profound lie. The shocking revelation of his birth had been buried beneath the soil of a new world, a secret that had crossed an ocean to die, leaving behind a man who was, finally and only, himself.